everyone. I'm Jen Holden, serving currently as president of the International Association for Near-Death Studies, and here to welcome you in this third of a series of a new production about near-death experiences that we hope you're going to enjoy. With me today are Todd Huey, the producer of the series, and Eben Alexander, the star of this particular episode. And hi, all. Hey, so I just want to let viewers know that as you go, we're going to have a brief little exchange here. Then you'll see the episode in full, and then you can ask questions and let me know when you ask a question. Put it in the Q&A, not the chat, but the Q&A, and let me know if you want it to go to Todd, to Eben, or to both of them. And then after we see the episode, we'll have question and answer interaction with you, our audience. And just to remind you that this viewing is free, but we have an ulterior motive. It's not hidden, that we are hoping that you'll be inspired by what you see and that you'll be willing to donate to the funding to complete the first 4 episodes of the first season that Todd is hoping to air publicly. So with that little introduction, and if there's anything else you want to add to that, Todd, and also tell us what inspired you to do this series.
Well, when I started researching, this was back in probably 2016, and it started with a conversation with Mary Neal. I had seen all the videos that had been done before, and I was fascinated with the whole concept of near-death experience, but I didn't know much about it. And I watched one of her stories from another entity, and I saw some of the stories that had been done from some of the others, Eben and some of the others, but I wasn't satisfied with the way I felt people should be drawn into these stories. And so we came up with this concept of using animations and artist renditions and AI artist renditions with different artists creating a different feel for each person. And so for Eben's story, we've got Hewey Matsumura out of Kyoto, Japan, who is a world famous anime animator and artist. And he loved Eben's story. And what we would do is we'd take the story that I would interview with Eben, cut it down to the script, hand it to him, and let him interpret it like a combat artist would, look like a police artist. Let him do it that way. And then we put it together. So it is an interpretation, but it's one that we thought would bring people deeper into Eben's story, deeper into Mary's story, to Howard's story, and hopefully into Dr. Rajiv Parti's story. That's where we're looking for the money to finish his story in part 2 of Mary Neal, which is her after effects, which is extremely emotional. And so Eben was my second interview. I was actually very nervous. And Mary even said, you know, you're going to go interview a brain surgeon, smartest guy in the room. And Eben didn't disappoint. The master of polysyllabic words and phrases I have never heard before in my life, but you grow to love them. I think, Eben, how many times did I get up there? 3 times, 1 time for audio and twice for the interview. Once before you could talk about your NDE, you came in as an expert. Then we came back and we did the interview and told your story.
Well, it's not rocket science, okay? So, I loved your engagement with all this, Todd. I mean, that was one thing that really impressed me about you and your work and your project. But also, you know, I could compare it with a lot of other kind of interactions I've had with people trying to help share the story. And I was just very much taken with your passion to get it right. And to me, that was very important. I did not sense at any point that you were going to try and put your own spin on it, but that in many ways you were just trying to share the kind of beauty and the love and the simplicity of it in many ways. Even though it's a fairly complex story, I think what you ended up doing was bringing it into a very accessible level for many, many people. And that's why I'm very happy that I participated in this project with you. And I think, IANDS support is important, because I think this is really going to go in a very good direction to help the world at large get on board with the beautiful and comforting and scientifically based reality of near-death experiences and their demonstration of the afterlife, in the setting of many other lines of evidence that combine with NDEs. There's now really no reasonable question whatsoever about the reality of the afterlife. And I think that your series helps to really kind of bring that to the fore for the general public.
Well, and that's when we decided to do the animations, we thought about reenactments. People wanted me to do reenactments, and I kept away from them as much as possible. We had to do one small one for Mary at the river, but for yours and for Howard's and for Raj Parti's, it's really going to be the artist rendition, because we felt that reenactments would look cheesy. Both all you NDEers say the same thing. You cannot comprehend the beauty, the detail, the colors, the sounds. You cannot get it. It's like trying to convey the universe to an ant, and you just can't. So I said to my artists, I remember when you said, you're a speck of awareness on a butterfly wing. So I told it to Hewey. I said, he's a speck of awareness on a butterfly wing. He says, you mean you want me to draw a speck? And I said, I'll tell you what, let's compromise. Let's artistically compromise, and we'll do a younger, more handsome Johnny Quest kind of Eben, who's sitting on the butterfly wing. He says, okay, I can roll with that.
Good.
And
Well, the important word to stress is awareness, not spec. And I think that's where he really took it the right direction. So
yes, he did, and I thought he did a marvelous job with your sister. But that's later on. Anyway, Eben was our second interview, and it was a very powerful interview. He came in first as an expert witness, which we used in Mary's piece. And I've got more that I can bring into the other episodes, because he wasn't able to speak about his NDE. And then he had an opening. So we went back and we did it again. And then I haunted him a third time with some audio corrections that I needed, because I wanted, when he goes the earthworm's view, the one thing Eben does is he'll sometimes just glaze over it because he said it so many times. So I had to go back in, have him recouch it, and take us down the earthworm's view. And that was another interpretation that between my editor and Hewey and myself, to come up with something that visually might be very fascinating, of the human being going down a tunnel that gradually you lose yourself and become something else. And so hopefully, Eben wrote a nice review, and I thank you, Eben. I was more nervous with your review than anyone else.
I don't know what it was about your visiting our home that made you nervous, but
no, not visiting the home. It's just I wanted to make sure I did right by you.
Yeah, well, you did a great job. You really did. So, and that's why I've remained so engaged with this and really support your work. I really think it's going to help this world get on board. And your comments earlier were very much aligned with kind of my recognitions, attempts, to use CGI and use reenactments. It does appear kind of cheesy, because once you get into that realm, that spiritual realm, you're in a realm that's completely elevated up outside of our concept of time and temporal flow. And that's one of the reasons why it's so difficult to depict. I mean, when you're depicting a world where people can have life reviews and birth, death, everything in between, past lives, future lives can all be seen simultaneously. That's a big challenge to present to people in a way that you can really contain and maintain the kind of emotional beauty of it all, and the kind of strength and passion that these kind of journeys entail. And I think that your approach with world-class animators is an absolutely beautiful way to do this.
Thank you.
So anything else before we go ahead and see the episode?
Well, just to let people know that this is the first time out of the gate that anyone's ever going to see Eben's episode, the same way we do with Mary's and Howard's. I wanted to show the IANDS community first so they could get behind it. And then it's 6 degrees of separation to everyone in the world, because we have not sold this project yet, because we met with one distributor. He said, where's your 4th episode? Where's your 2nd out? I said, well, we got to raise the money. We need $150,000 an episode. That doesn't pay really much for me. For me, it's like 60 days work. But my editor, animator editor, and my artists, they work constantly to get it done right. And that's where the money goes. It goes into them. And God bless Arturo Meza, my editor, my animator. He's my music creator. He is my right hand. He's part of my left hand. Without Arturo, we even said here at Inspiration Ministries, at INSP, which is the top 10 of all networks in America, they said, there's no one more talented in America than Arturo Meza to pull this off. He's been offered lots more money, but he loves what we're trying to do. And so he stayed with this project, even though he was offered a job with twice the salary he gets here. But he is so tied to this project and to our vision, he wanted to stay. And so, we're looking for that extra $150,000. We're talking also to people who have other financial means of helping us, because we're nonprofit. I can't say that word, but if you have any interest of other funding options, contact me, info@lifebeyonddeath.tv. I think it'll be up on there it is. It'll go up on the chat, but contact me there. Certainly, Eben, at one point, I definitely want to talk to you, because I know that Bruce Grayson had some surgery, and he has been hurt so much by people who've had an agenda. And I think with Mary and you contacting him, perhaps he would meet with me to write a review to see what we're trying to do that's different, so that maybe I can change his mind. Because we had that conversation. He says, I've been burned too many times. I don't trust you TV people. You're all the same. I'm not. I'm 65 years old. I'm a historian, a degreed historian, and I want to do it right by the person's story we're telling. And so I know that Bruce has connections, and I know we're going to find that money and finish that episode. And then if a network wants it, then they'll say, well, what about these other stories to continue on? Because it's an anthology, and we can continue adding on to that, because we've built the mousetrap. Building the mousetrap was the tough nut. But now that we've got it built, we can crank one out every 3 months. So
great. Well, I'm anticipating that the viewers are really anxious to see the episode. So can we go ahead and watch it? Okay, great.
Here we go.
All right.
Since the dawn of humanity, over 108 billion people have lived on the Earth. Of that number, more than 100 billion have already died. The simple truth is this: everyone dies, and so will you. So what happens after you die? Is there an afterlife, or a continuing consciousness? In a world full of conflicting opinions about this issue, whose opinion should you trust? Opinion survey professionals say the top 5 most trusted professions are doctors, nurses, scientists, teachers, and first responders. Join us as we examine how these trusted individuals dealt with the single most traumatic event that changed their lives forever: their own deaths. This is their story of life beyond death from the NDE Files.
Well, I awoke on November 10th, 2008 with severe back pain. It was about 4:30 in the morning. It was the worst pain I'd ever had in my back. I was having grand mal seizures and was gone from this world. I was in coma. I had that 10% chance of survival, that I was extremely ill. But to me, the fascinating part is what happened to me. And that was this extraordinary journey, because it showed me that whole concept is completely wrong and it's completely backwards. And that's where I think my NDE and aftermath since then has been so productive at helping me to come to a deeper understanding of the nature of reality.
Eben stepped forward and told his story. He risked his career, he risked his reputation, And I appreciate that he was able to have this experience and then go back and look for proof that it was a true spiritual experience. He was able to go back and discover something really, really profound.
What happens for you, Eben, as you see this yet again?
Well, anytime I revisit my story, especially some of those absolutely beautiful parts, my recognition of that guardian angel as being someone important to me in my life, who I just never met, but due to my circumstances of adoption and all that, I mean, it still brings tears to my eyes. I mean, I still, it's a very emotional thing for me. I know when I read, for example, in Proof of Heaven, I read the audiobook. That is, my voice is there for the audiobook. And we had to re-record that part towards the end where I'm describing, Betsy, that beautiful guardian angel. And I would just break down each time, and this was years after the event. I'd shared it with hundreds of groups. And yet it's still, for me, it's still just a beautiful touchstone, emotional touchstone for the depth of our connection through the binding force of love. Essentially, that's what it reminds me of. And to me, that's the most important lesson to come out of the NDE community. One of the most important message for humanity is this deep sense of love and connection that we're all in this together. And I think Todd and his team certainly did a great job of kind of conveying that. Their version of it certainly draws me in beautifully and brings tears to my eyes. So thanks for that, Todd. Thanks for this beautiful avenue of getting into my story and the kind of richness of that beautiful sense of loving connection.
You're welcome, Eben. It was our honor to tell your story as best as we possibly could.
And I just want to remind viewers that if you have any questions for either Todd or Eben, you can put them in the Q&A and let us know if it's for one or both of them, and they'll respond. So one of the things I noticed was the reference to the article by the 3 physicians. And I know that, Eben, you've encountered a lot of resistance from some quarters of the medical community. And I'm wondering whether, since the publication of that article, and that has abated, or whether you're still fighting that battle.
Well, I've actually come to realize that some of the greatest support I have in this world are from scientific and medical colleagues. I mean, once you pay any attention to that medical case report, you realize all the crazy fluff and discussion about my story out in the public sphere that's uninformed is just completely off target. The science behind this is enough to really absolutely demand your attention. Physicians, nurses, other scientists who understand enough about medicine to kind of interpret where that report is going, they take big notice, because essentially there were 2 major conclusions, I would say, that came packaged with that report in many ways. One was an acknowledgement that this brain was far too damaged to have any kind of dream or hallucination. That's a very important thing for people to get. And it's one of the reasons why my kind of critics who are not scientific, but out there writing articles in the public sphere, cling desperately to the statement that I was in a medically induced coma. And that's just not true. I mean, as Bruce Grayson points out in his book After, his memoir, which I highly recommend to people, he's a skeptical medical scientist who studied NDEs for more than 4.5 decades now. And his beautiful book After is an excellent introduction and kind of elaboration into this field. But in chapter 10, he pretty much devotes it to my story and points out that I went into coma before I had any sedating medications, and I came out of coma while I was still on very powerful sedating medications. So you can throw that out the window, and it's important to get that because the damage caused by meningoencephalitis, which was very extensive, even in those first hours when I hit the emergency room, was so much, and the evidence that on CT and MRI scans that it was really my entire brain that was affected. There was not an island of cortex that would be available to serve as a neurocalculator to give me this kind of ultra real experience, but my entire brain and brainstem were under attack. And so that's their first major point, was really they were pointing out how that very ill brain could not have hallucinated or dreamed of this at all. And that would explain why it was so much more real and memorable and life-changing than any dream I'd ever had. Now, the other major point they made was in response to a challenge from the peer review editors of the scientific journal of Nervous and Mental Diseases. And these peer review editors said, well, wait a minute, this case is absurd. That's the word they used. Because you don't have people this sick from a gram-negative E. coli bacterial meningoencephalitis, deep coma for a week on a ventilator all that time with all the lab values and everything else associated, who then end up making a full recovery. And they said, how do you authors explain this? And the authors explained it by saying, well, he had a near-death experience. And it's because they were aware of other cases of near-death experiences where you had extraordinary and inexplicable, at least from the perspective of modern medical science, recoveries. I mean, the very fact that all my memories returned over about 2 months, and that includes not just all my personal memories, but all of my semantic knowledge of physics, neuroscience, neurosurgery, cosmology, every bit of it. And in fact, I came to realize in close conversations with friends and family long after coma compared to those same conversations well before coma, that the memories were more complete. Now, how do you explain that? In our book, Living in a Mindful Universe, we really bring the science and spirituality together. And we go into all the evidence from a neurosurgical perspective that memories are not stored in the brain. But that's such a nail in the coffin of materialist neuroscience that you don't hear it discussed very often. And yet, especially when you review all that robust scientific literature, for example, on reincarnation out of University of Virginia, with more than 2,700 cases, they've studied 1,700 cases of past life memories in children that they've solved, where they actually found the person who lived before that the child claims to be. You realize we need a much bigger model for consciousness and memory than just the brain. In a given lifetime. In other words, it's a much bigger theater of operations to explain. And that's where I think I feel that my NDE has been such a gift. It certainly takes us away from that bleak and paltry fiction of materialism that tries to pretend that we're all separate beings, that this is all just a chaotic mechanistic dance, that they try to pretend that if you project the physical laws applied to electrons, protons, quarks, atoms, molecules, build it all up, the laws of physics, chemistry, biology, that you explain all that happens. And in that modeling, materialist scientists proudly tell you you have no free will, given that it's all just chemical reactions and electron fluxes. But this is where the complete flip in the scientific world, that in many ways is keyed by that beautiful kind of tip of the spear of near-death experiences, helps us to come to understand we live in a much grander universe. And it's one where we're spiritual beings that are deeply interconnected with each other and joined together through that incredible force of love at the core of the universe. That's what gives NDEers, they come back and have no fear of death. They realize it's not an annihilation of awareness, but actually an expansion of conscious awareness. And that's really the gift. And this world, this troubled, polarized world of ours, can benefit tremendously from a wide kind of sharing of stories like Todd has done in depicting this and other NDEs to help people come to understand they're part of the natural world. To even use the word supernatural is, in a way, saying that consciousness is a supernatural phenomenon. Let's not discuss it. But consciousness is the only thing any human being has ever known. That's a deep lesson from quantum physics, is there's not an objective physical world out there independent of our kind of spirit and our existing spirit, and that's all interconnected. So it's an important time for this kind of message, and thank you, Todd, for getting it out in a clear fashion.
You're welcome.
Absolutely.
Well, as I've said before, what Eben has seen, what Mary has seen with Howard, it's like they're advanced recon. They go out there in front of us beyond what we would consider the norm, beyond into a place that we cannot go. We see through a glass darkly, is what scripture says, or through a veil darkly. But they have seen this, and they come back and they bring back this message of hope. They bring back this message of love. They bring back this message of as Eben might call, a multiverse of beauty that we just don't comprehend here on this earth. That's an area I would like to touch in the future, is to go there, to go ahead and try and explain that to people visually more, to sit down with you guys and go into the next step. What's the next step? Also interviewing the families of the NDEers who have gone through a great deal of trauma. When I asked Mary, I said, what do your kids think about what your NDE is? She says, I've never asked them. Now that's an arrangement that she has with her family, because there's a third rail there. Everyone's got a third rail when they come back from an NDE. And you don't want to touch that third rail because it's painful for the people within the family, within the individual, but especially the family. But I think we need to touch the third rail. Maybe because I'm just stupid. I just want to touch the third rail. I want to put the key in the socket, as a kid to get electrocuted. But there's so much more that's there. And I'm excited to see more of Eben's stuff and more NDEs to give us a look at the elephant from a different perspective.
Yeah, thank you. We're getting questions, and interestingly, some of the questions are touching on some of the topics that you've addressed. So most recently, the subject of children. What do your children think of your NDE now, Eben? One person is wanting to know.
Well, I think that my two sons, Eben and Bond, now ages, 35 and 25, they've gained a tremendous amount from the NDE. They've watched their dad struggle to get to a deeper understanding, and they've participated with that. In fact, both of them, for example, are avid users of Sacred Acoustics. Sacred Acoustics is the binaural beat brainwave entrainment developed by my partner, Karen Newell, life partner for the last 11 years. And we use it for journeying. I use it for returning to that realm, not just to recover memories of my NDE, but to develop beautiful relationships and ongoing kind of guidance with the beautiful entities, including my loving birth sister in that realm. In fact, I talk in the third book, in Living in a Mindful Universe, it was co-written with Karen, about how I finally encountered the soul of my adoptive father. If I had scripted this, he would have been there front and center, and yet he was nowhere to be found in the experience. And I discovered during this encounter with him during meditation, 2.5 years later, that he was part of planning my NDE, but that in fact, he knew that if he appeared as that guardian angel, in spite of the fact that I had a 1 in 10 million diagnosis of E. coli meningitis in an adult and a 1 in a billion recovery, that I would have been tempted to reject it. Oh, you see who you want to see on the way out, that my kind of conventional materialist mind would have somehow wiggled that fact into deny the reality of it. And that's why I think it was so important in retrospect that my guardian angel was someone I did not recognize from my life experience at that time. And that was a very important, and that look of, do you finally get it? Wow, yes, I finally get it, Betsy. But my sons are both very active users of Sacred Acoustics. Bond's used it for lucid dreaming and for other kind of psychic journeying. And my son Eben has listened to theta tones to enhance his studying he's in medicine. He's now in a fellowship and has finished his residency. I'm very proud of both my boys. And Eben has used theta tones from Sacred Acoustics thousands of hours to enhance his studying. And he's convinced that it greatly enhanced his performance on board tests and that kind of thing. So they both have grown hugely from my experience, and they they enjoy talking about it, and certainly about the lessons. They can see the bigger picture and how this is such a gift to people to come to this deeper understanding of the truth of our existence, which is that our souls are eternal and that we're really bound together through love. So I'm very grateful that my family and extended family have also benefited from my adventure. And I realize why Mary's case is a little different. And of course, she had to face kind of a deep reality in her story about her son. And that would have been a challenge for anybody to come to, accept that message so fully of, at least when it all happened in the NDE. So I fully understand her. I greatly appreciate her sharing of her story. To me, it's been very important. I love her depiction of that beautiful encounter deep in her journey. And I'm grateful for all these. I mean, to me, one of the biggest gifts of sharing my story was I then had thousands of people come back and share theirs back to me. And often that would begin with, I never told anybody this before, but, and then they'd share a story that could change the world. In fact, the second book, Map of Heaven, is really our attempt to share a lot of those stories, just to reveal to people, this is just not about some Harvard neurosurgeon who happened to have an extraordinary experience. This is the background of human daily life. These stories are what happen when we leave the physical world. And when you especially begin to realize, thanks to the work of Christopher Kerr, Kerr, he's an MD, PhD, who is in hospice in Buffalo, New York, and wrote a beautiful book called Death is But a Dream, where he basically demonstrated that in hospice, the very same things happen. Encountering souls of departed loved ones, coming into this rich sense of love, being the connecting force with us. And when you realize that NDEs and actual death in the hospice world mirror each other perfectly, it gets rid of that silly materialist argument that NDEers don't die, but tells us that NDEers are absolutely showing us something very real about what to expect when we leave the physical plane once and for all. And I think Christopher Kerr's work is extremely important to kind of connect the dots and help us all get on board with this beautiful and very comforting reality that also fully supports then the world of after-death communications and the whole bigger territory of spiritual evidence that people get just living these lives. It's not supernatural. These are just the events that happen in normal people's lives in the current era, and getting them out there in large measure is very important.
Yeah.
Funny you mention that, Eben, because we interviewed Chris Kerr, and it's for a future episode. And we had a very interesting conversation because he said, according to my patients, NDEs is way harder. He says, these people are finishing things up, they're wrapping things up, they're getting ready to transition, they want to be there, they wake up, they go, oh, am I still here? I was over there and I have to come back here. They are finished. And what the thing that really got me about Chris, he doesn't like to talk about spiritual things, but I said, look, you're almost like a priest because you're there at the end, whether you want to be or not. And he said, the fact of the matter is these people, there's always something good in an individual. And it is that good that it's the hand that reaches out that helps them come across as they let go. And he was a fascinating individual, he and his team, and what they've been able to document, folks out there. They record these things in videos. They tell stories. You have to sign an agreement that if you're going to be studied, you can't be on any kind of hallucinogenic drugs or anything. You have to go through a very tough death that doesn't have much in the way of a painkiller. So these people are actually very lucid to be able to convey the message of their transitioning. And that's what makes it so very special, that these people are also very brave reconnaissance people, a way to take us right to the doorway. They take us right there. But Trudy Harris, who's a nurse we interviewed for Glimpses of Heaven, she saw over, I think it was 1,500 people who went into hospice and died. And the miraculous things that she saw during that transition period, from people and angels and visions and healing and things that are happening during this very narrow part of our life. but a great book, a great interview. She's retired now, but she ran a hospice in Florida, magnificent. And she ties right in with Chris Kerr. And they're like 10 years apart telling the story, but yet it could be the same story.
All right.
Thanks. You know, another topic that we've touched on is Howard Storm's NDE was involved a big section of hell. And neither your story, Eben, nor Mary's seems to include a reference to hell, but I wondered if you wanted to say anything more about that.
Yes, well, I'd say to my understanding for the general public, it's about 5% or so of these NDE stories that actually are hellish or distressing. I think the number relatively might be a little higher than that because they're even more underreported than NDEs in general, because people are so worried about sharing that, even more so than sharing a nice, pleasant kind of love-based NDE. But from my perspective, I think if I had just gone to the earthworm I view and then come back to this world, I would have had a hellish NDE. But I got to see so much more, even though I passed through that earthworm I view multiple times, as I said, but I always, was then headed up into these brilliant, beautiful realms. But I think that some of the hellish NDEs are due to a life review where somebody's been busy handing out pain and suffering to others, and in selfish and greedy. Because one of the things I know, Bruce Grayson had talked about this in a paper he wrote in Journal of Near-Death Studies back in the fall of 2021, that a large number of NDEers are having these life reviews. And in his group of more than, I think it was 700 cases total in that database, 25% had had life reviews. But the interesting thing is they often experience it from the emotional perspective of others around them. So in other words, your life review, you go through those events, but not just from your perspective, but you get to feel how your actions and thoughts impacted others around you. So if you've been handing out a lot of pain and suffering, that's not going to necessarily be a pleasant experience. So I would say that life reviews in many ways are the golden rule: treat others as you would like to be treated, written into the fabric of the universe. Now, there are other categories of negative NDEs that do not fit that model of just a kind of a distressing life review. So I don't want that to be considered the be all and end all of it. But I think from my perspective, a lot of the cases that I've heard from people were basically based on a life review that was showed them they had a lot of correcting to do. And that's why NDEs and life reviews are so beautiful, because they show us kind of options for a mid-course correction. But that ultimately, all of this is about healing, becoming more whole. And especially when I look at our kind of ego-besotted world, and from my perspective as a physician, I recognize how the ego mind is always associated with addictive situations, and that it's really an intervention from kind of higher soul that enables us to escape beyond that. And I think, that's where I view meditation as being such an important tool. You don't have to have an NDE to get all this and to kind of start using this kind of information to come into wholeness and healing yourself by meditation, centering prayer. Once you realize that your mental space is not created by the brain, but is actually a shared mind with the universe at large, and was shared with all fellow sentient beings, then you realize that going within mind is a beautiful way to get out into the universe at large. And that's where we can really start to share this healing by acknowledging that connection we have with others. And so I think meditation and centering prayer are beautiful ways to give us comfort and relieve the anxiety of our kind of ego distresses in this life, and help us to open to that higher soul perspective that helps us to heal self and others. And ultimately, the whole world will be healed through this larger perspective.
Right. And part of that process of healing is bringing along the scientific establishment. And one of our viewers asked, how do you think the scientific establishment can make the leap to accepting consciousness as being fundamental rather than a product of the brain?
Well, I think, for example, our book, Living in a Mindful Universe, is a great start. It unites science and spirituality very powerfully. I would also offer up a free resource available to everybody at large. BigelowInstitute.org. Robert Bigelow held a contest in 2021. Best scientific evidence for continuity of conscious awareness after permanent bodily death. And there are now 28 essays at BigelowInstitute.org that won that prize. And they had to all demonstrate at least 5 years of research experience studying the afterlife question. And when you start reading those papers at BigelowInstitute.org, you will find a tremendous amount of scientific evidence that fully supports the reality of the afterlife. I think Jeffrey Mishlov's winning #1 paper there is very important, but likewise for the hardcore scientists in the world, I would steer them especially to Pim van Lommel's second place essay. He's a Dutch cardiologist who's written extensively about all this. And at the end of it, he makes an argument for the one mind, which is the same argument we make in Living in Mindful Universe. In fact, he references our book as a big source of one mind, as well as Larry Dossey's book entitled One Mind, and Steve Taylor's book, Spiritual Science, and Bernardo Kastrup's paper of The Universe in Consciousness. It came out, I think it was Journal of Consciousness Studies 2018. But anyway, Pim van Lommel in his scientific essay for Bigelow mentions those as beautiful sources of the scientific evidence that we're sharing one mind. In addition, for the real hardcore enthusiast, I would recommend a deep dive into the work of Ed Kelly. He is one of the leading investigators, along with Jim Tucker and Bruce Grayson at the University of Virginia Division of Perceptual Studies. And Ed Kelly has edited with multiple authors 3 incredibly powerful scientific books supporting the reality of basically this this mind force. Evolutionary panentheism is kind of the philosophical answer beyond just idealism, which postulates that mind is primary in the universe. But in many ways, the notion of panentheism puts it together in a more spiritually powerful and scientifically explanatory form. But his 3 books, that's Ed Kelly, Irreducible Mind in 2007, Beyond Physicalism 2015, and Consciousness Unbound, which came out in March of 2021. And for the most rigorous scientific minds out there, that work, from my perspective, is some of the leading work. And he's got quantum physicists like Henry Stapp, who absolutely knows his way around the measurement paradox and the issues of the brain-mind connection from a quantum perspective, and Bernardo Kastrup, many other kind of leading voices in the modern philosophical and scientific exploration of the afterlife question. And in reality, any scientist who takes the time to go through this will quickly realize that the evidence not only for the afterlife, but for reincarnation is so strong that if you're not working those into your theoretical models, your theoretical model is pathetically weak. It amazes me in looking back on my own career, as a materialist neuroscientist who believes brains creates consciousness, which I subscribed to for several years. What a waste of time. And all that kind of sweeping under the rug of evidence, saying that can't be, that's got to be hallucination, instead of embracing the evidence and realizing if you want to get to truth, you really have to accept the evidence and study it rigorously. And that's exactly what you find in, BigelowInstitute.org, and certainly in those Ed Kelly books and in our book, Living in a Mindful Universe. These are all excellent resources to demonstrate that this is a scientific revolution. Religions have had 5,000 plus years to try and convey this message of treat others as you would like to be treated, the golden rule. And yet NDEs do it very beautifully. And in a modern scientifically examined world, they help us to come to a deeper understanding of reality that I think is very beneficial to anyone who claims to be a seeker in the modern era, and certainly those who claim to have a scientific and philosophically advanced notion of the nature of reality.
So to shift focus a little bit, one of our viewers is asking, can you recommend to caregivers how to communicate with people in coma?
I think the best thing is just through For one thing, as most nurses, know, you talk to them as if they're here. Nurses have gotten this, by the way. I give them credit fully. As a physician, I claim many of us physicians needed a bigger thumping. That's why I needed this big thumping. But I think talk to them as if they're there. And of course, meditation and centering prayer, from my perspective, are very powerful ways to connect with those who are kind of on that cusp or making the transition to the other side. And so I think that just being aware of knowing that these kind of communications can happen really opens the door tremendously to people accepting it when they receive such a communication. And I know I can think back now on nurses who told me stories before my coma, tried to wake me up to this, of how they could communicate with those who were trying to die, people in deep coma, and how they could tell if that comatose patient was waiting, for example, for another family member to arrive. And I know nurses tried to convince me of that. And I believe these nurses, but I just wasn't capable of doing it myself, and I didn't know what to make of it. But the deep reality is I think we all have the power to have that communication through meditation, centering prayer, and by simply being open to it. Being aware that when we hear their voice and when we invite them in, and then it happens, don't be sitting there beating yourself up trying to disprove it and pretend it's some hallucination or I just had to make that up in my mind, but simply go with the flow. And again, I don't pretend that I'm teaching nurses who have any real experience in this field anything, because I think the nurses have always gotten it. And that's because they're often there when the loved ones pass and they see things with the family and with the loved ones. And I certainly appreciate the nurses that were involved in my care. I appreciate my physicians too. I'm grateful for all of them and that they were open enough to really kind of get me back and not completely squash my discussion of NDEs, although some of the doctors tried to tell me that dying brain plays all kinds of tricks. And so initially, since I didn't have my neuroscience knowledge back and I didn't yet know about the depth of my illness, the medical parameters, I took my doctor's word at heart. Dying brain plays all kinds of tricks. So as I told my older son, Eben IV, who was majoring in neuroscience in college at the time, when he came home 2 days after I got out of the hospital, day before Thanksgiving, 2008, I told him it was way too real to be real. And that's kind of my best description of it when my doctors had told me it couldn't have happened. But then when I got my medical records and all my knowledge was coming back, I went, oh my gosh, no wonder it seemed too real to be real. It really happened.
What I really appreciate what Eben did for you, Eben, your son, is he told you, read nothing, research nothing, write it down. Write down the primary source right now without being colored from the outside. That was brilliant on his behalf, because knowing you, the way you operate, you want to go find the solutions outside of what you experience. So I thought that was brilliant.
Todd, you're absolutely right. I fully credit Eben Alexander IV because it was that, he drove overnight because he heard I had not been sleeping. I was so energized by the kind of spiritual richness of the experience that I would just sit up all night by the fire. I was writing, trying to record all my memories from it. But I was also starting to read into some quantum physics. I was getting ready to get a whole bunch of NDE books. And that's when he told me, don't you dare write down everything you can remember of your own experience first. And over about 6 weeks or so, I wrote 20,000 words. That was my original database. And only then did I dive into that NDE literature. And that's why I was absolutely shocked. I kept running into these incredible kind of similarities in terms of the feeling, the emotional power, that bathing in the ocean of love, the journeying into a far kind of superior realm in many ways. All those hallmarks of NDEs were coming out in story after story after story. And of course, then that echoed back, because when Proof of Heaven was published, I would hear from thousands of people who had never shared their experience with anybody else. But mine gave them enough of a memory of their experience that they had to reach out to me. And that, again, is why we wrote that second book, Map of Heaven, where I put a lot of those stories out there of, common everyday people having these experiences, because that's who has them. Normal, everyday folk. And that's why I've learned so much from so many of those experiences. And it's one of my greatest points of gratitude for having shared my story is that so many other people have shared their stories with me. Tremendous validation and affirmation.
I see it almost as post-traumatic stress, having interviewed hundreds of veterans in my career, that they don't want to talk about it. But when someone else comes forward and lays it out, they say, oh, I guess I can talk about it. People won't think I'm crazy. I mean, here's this brain surgeon had one. Here's this spinal surgeon. Here's this professor who becomes a pastor. Here's this person, that person. And hopefully that opens the door for them to feel that they're safe enough to share, whether it's a positive or a negative NDE, to share it, because you said it today. There's so many other researchers have said they think there's a lot more people out there with NDEs who aren't talking about it. Right. And one we're trying to chase down is John Hernandez. John, in case you're listening. And he was a group NDE. He was a leader of hotshots, 19 hotshots. They all were incinerated in a fire, like Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego out of there. They all had, the whole group went up together. And when they came down with different experiences, they came into their bodies were not burned at all. Yet all their steel tools were melted. That's 2,000 degrees. You don't walk away from 2,000 degrees. You're incinerated. And those guys went off. One committed suicide. The others have gone off, and they're being very quiet about it. It's almost like it's so disturbing, they're having trouble discussing it. But having guys like you and guys, other NDEers who can reach them and say, it's okay to talk about what you saw, to encourage them. That's what I'm hoping what happens with this show, with anything more that we do, with all the work that people have done out there in NDEs, is encourage those who haven't spoken to speak.
I would also encourage people to share. There's a slightly different category of experience called the shared death experience. And these occur in perfectly healthy, normal people. Usually a loved one, say some guy working in his garden in Massachusetts, and his mother is on her deathbed in California. But as she leaves this world and her soul departs, her soul comes through, grabs his soul right out of the garden, takes it along, even to witnessing a full-blown life review of her departing soul. But then the bystander soul comes back to this world. And there are, I know I heard a lot of those kind of stories early on when I was sharing my own story before Proof of Heaven even came out. And I wasn't sure what to make of them. And then I read Raymond Moody's book, Glimpses of Eternity. I think it was published in 2011. But that book is completely about shared death experiences. And these cases completely debunk that silly materialist pseudo explanation, that it's all due to oxygen tension into the dying brain or carbon dioxide buildup or some other parameter of a physiologically distressed body, because shared death experiences happen in people who are often, perfectly healthy. And yet they share the very same things. And that's a whole different category. I know Raymond Moody certainly opened the door to shared death in a beautiful way. I also realize that William Peters is another investigator. He's worked in hospice going back in San Francisco Bay Area all the way back to the 70s, early AIDS crisis. And William Peters has written a beautiful book. I think it's At Heaven's Door. And that is about shared death, and also his attempts with the Shared Crossing Project to kind of help people who are losing a loved one enhance their prospects for having a shared death experience. So these are all just categories of scientific investigation and pursuit around these beautiful and everyday human experiences that can help all of us come to a deeper understanding of our existence here on Earth and in a larger universe to boot.
So another viewer is asking, have you had an MRI since your illness? And how is your brain now compared to what it looked like when you were in the depths of your coma?
Well, that's a beautiful question. And, the problem is in the current era, you can't necessarily justify paying for an MRI that's just done out of that kind of idle curiosity. I would love to have another MRI done. I did have MR angiography done. That is kind of a different form of MRI that doesn't necessarily show you all that we would like to see. But I would be happy to go back and have another MRI and see what's going on with that brain. I know from the earlier evidence, especially in that medical case report, there was tremendous damage to my brain. And that is the part that is so surprising to see this basically complete recovery over 2 months. So maybe I'll just have to go out and just get an MRI. But I would love to see what it looks like now compared to those earlier studies. The one when I was very ill showed a very damaged brain indeed. And that's, most of the evidence, the medical evidence for the depth of my coma really comes from the neurologic exams. The value of the scans is to show that there's no little island of neocortex that was spared. And that's pretty much what the scan showed, is that it was a global phenomenon, and that I had really full thickness damage because I had edema. I had a lot of swelling down at the gray-white junction, which is the deepest layer. So that means that the infection, which is on the outside of the neocortex, has inflamed so much that your all 6 layers of neocortex are badly affected by this. And certainly the kind of mentation I had deep in coma, which I think in many ways that earthworm eye view was kind of giving me a glimpse of the kind of consciousness I might expect from that brain being that ill. Although I've come to realize that a deeper interpretation of that earthworm eye view, especially informed by reading the Tibetan Book of the Dead, is that potentially that was a more common realm. But I assure people, don't be afraid. I mean, as spiritual beings, to me, one of the clearest messages of all this is the more we get to that source, that God force of pure existence. For me, that was the core realm. And in that realm, it's pure love. There is no battle between good and evil. The apparent evil and darkness only emerge as we get way out here towards the edges, far from that spiritual center. But in the spiritual center, it is truly all about love. And that's really, I think, one of the most universal lessons that comes from the NDE community. And I would also recommend a book called The Essence of Religions by Christopher Koppes, Koppes. It's a beautiful book. He's a member of IANDS from the Netherlands. I know he's presenting at the conference coming up in a few weeks. I'm very excited about seeing him present. But that book of his, he compared the 5 main religions of this world and used NDEs as the gold standard of teaching lessons of love, kindness, mercy, compassion, forgiveness. And I think it's an excellent book that really shows how our religious ideologies can be tweaked and improved to fully reflect this deep message of NDEs that we're really all in this together. We're here to take care of the least, the last, and the lost. And this is really all about harmony of human spirit being here to care for this world at large. And I think that's really the deep lesson of NDEs, and that's one that could change this world for the better.
So I'm noticing that we probably have about 6 more minutes. One more question for you, Eben, and then maybe we'll shift focus back to the production and that whole big picture. But one of the viewers is saying, I'd really like to believe this, but it's hard for me. And was there any veridical aspect in your near-death experience, or what can you say about veridical perception?
Well, the most important one was seeing my birth sister. That was an absolute shocker, because when I came back from this journey, having been through this realm that was way too real to be real, her presence, time after time of passing through that Gateway Valley was astonishing. I felt I knew her deeply and richly and personally. And yet, because that amnesia for events of my life was still a huge part of the deeper lesson I was to learn about the nature of memory, conscious awareness, brain and mind, all of that, those deep lessons all had to result from that kind of configuration that involved the amnesia. But I came back to this world recognizing that beautiful guardian angel on the butterfly wing as someone very important to me. And yet I had no idea who she was. I knew I had never met her in my life. In fact, there were times in the month or 6 weeks or so post-coma where it was almost a deal breaker for me. In spite of that ultra reality, I was thinking, why in the world would the universe put me through this extraordinary journey and gift me with this kind of understanding and then had this kind of fake out where my dad was not there. My adoptive father, the neurosurgeon who was so important in my life. And I got an answer to that question about 2.5 years post-coma in deep meditation. And that was when my father's spirit actually appeared to me. He had passed over 4 years before my coma, was nowhere to be found in that NDE. And yet when I saw him in deep meditation, it came, all the information came as this kind of thought ball, because my intention on that meditation was, am I on the right path? And that question was asked while I was pursuing differential frequency brainwave entrainment, consciousness not created by the brain, all the different pieces that have come together. And in one wink and smile from my father in that meditation, I came to recognize that he had been working with my birth sister. They were in collaboration on this, but he couldn't be the leader. He couldn't be my main spiritual guide because, as I said earlier, that would allow me an open door to dismiss it as, oh, okay, you see who you want to see on the way out. And that's why I had to see someone who was very crucial to me in my lifetime. In fact, a huge part of my journey was all around the question of my adoption. I was put up for adoption when I was 11 days old, but my birth mother didn't want to let me go. Social services had taken me away for failure to thrive, but she didn't want to sign the adoption paper. So I was stuck in a baby dorm for 4 months. And that was an experience. I remember my adoptive father, the neurosurgeon, used to tell me, you can't possibly remember anything that happened to you in those first few weeks and months of your life. But fact is, I came to realize that that doubting of whether or not I even deserved to exist, doubting of whether I was worthy of the love of the universe from my adoption abandonment wound is something I struggle with right up till the time of my NDE. And in so many ways, having my birth sister there to be the spiritual guide was a crucial step in my understanding and a healing of that adoption abandonment wound. So all of it ties together in a very rich and powerful fashion for me that just emphasizes the ultra reality of the experience itself.
And I'll take this opportunity to make a little plug for an IANDS publication, because that aspect of your story appears in IANDS's book, The Self Does Not Die, which is a collection of over 125. The second edition is about to come out within the next couple months. 125 cases, well researched, of verified paranormal phenomena from near-death experiences, including mostly veridical perception of the material world, where people saw something in the material world that was later verified as accurate. But yours is an example of veridical perception from the transmaterial world that later comes to make sense with additional information. Yeah.
The general rubric for those cases where you encounter someone who has died, but don't know that they've died until you encounter them in that world, is they're called peak Indarian experiences. And yes, they're covered as a separate category in that book, The Self Does Not Die, which I think is an excellent kind of scientific work on the nature of veridical perception during near-death experiences.
Yeah, thank you. So back to we have just a minute or two, back to the bigger picture about this production. Todd, remind us, people can make donations at, and any amount will help, but of course, the more the better. And what's the place that they can donate? And it'll go into the chat, I'm sure, as well.
lifebeyonddeath.tv. And talking about vertical perception, we're covering that with Dr. Rajiv Parti in episode 2, because he had a very distinct veridical perception of traveling. When he died on the operating table in the hospital, he went around the other side of the world and witnessed his mother and his sister. He described their conversation, what they were wearing, what they were eating, and everything. When he woke up, his wife asked him where he, how he was. And he says, I was over there and I saw him, write all this down. And he told his wife to write down. She's a dentist, and they were both Hindus, and she wrote it all down. And she was hoping he would give him something, what kind of, did you see any of our gods? He said, no, but I saw Michael and Raphael and this angel of light, I think is Jesus. But he says, but I saw my mother, my sister, this is what they were wearing, this is what they were talking about, this is where they were sitting. And she wrote it all down and sent it to them, and it freaked them out, because it was a very hard case of vertical perception. But lifebeyonddeath.tv is the trailers for all 3 of the episodes. It's a place to make donations. It's a place to read reviews on it. I'll be doing updates, but probably bi-monthly updates. We're going now looking for some serious investors to finish it so we can get episode 2 done. And as interest peaks, as we begin selling it as a program, as a concept, we want to be able to add more. So it depends on who picks it up. With the writer's strike, we might actually be in a good place because there's going to be a shortage of content next year. And it's going to take us a little bit to get this last episode 2 done. So, and your prayers, folks, your prayers and your good wishes, but if everyone gives a few dollars, we're there. If everyone gives big dollars, we're there faster. But we know we're going to get there. We've got a good series, and I'm really proud to work with all the magnificent doctors and professors and nurses to get this done in my production team. It's a real blessing to do that.
And I really want to commend you about how conscientious you've been to make sure that your episodes really are true to what the experiencer experienced. You've been so collaborative working with experiencers and making sure that that what's conveyed is an accurate representation as far as they're concerned. And so I think that's the most important thing you can do is tell the truth and let people know what's actually happening with NDEs. So anything else before we close for today?
Not really, not for me. I'm just, thank you, Jan and the IANDS team, for your marvelous cooperation and hopping in this boat of ours and helping us get downriver. I really, really appreciate it. All of us together, working together and telling people, like I said, 6 degrees of separation from everyone on the planet. And we can get things done that way. And we can move into further stories and bridge off of what we started and do other stuff. But, you got to place your stake in the ground somewhere. And I thought that Eben's story and Mary's story and Howard's was a good place to start.
I agree.
I would like to just thank you, Jan, for all the work that IANDS does to really help, millions of people out there in the world who have had these experiences and those who are facing their own terminal diagnosis or potential bereavement, loss of a loved one. I think IANDS does a wonderful job globally of helping people to really come into a richer and more satisfying and refreshing sense of relationship with the universe at large, especially around that process of death of a body. And Todd, of course, I'd like to thank you very much for the work you're doing, which I think is an important way to get this out to the world, to help people come into more comfort, and most especially to realize we're really all in this together. And it's those binding forces of love that tie us together. And this world could stand to learn a little bit more of that lesson. And that's what NDEs in general, and certainly Life Beyond Death TV and your efforts are bringing to fruition. So thank you for that.
You're welcome. Thank you. It was an honor.
Thanks to you both, and thanks to our viewers, and everyone have a great rest of the day.
Okay.
Bye-bye.
Bye.